While waiting for any Elder Scrolls 6 news, very patiently, I happened upon a thought. Do firearms even belong in the same conversation as a high fantasy setting like Tamriel? After all, unlike at Bethesda Game Studios, time does not stand still. It inevitably moves forward, bringing with it new people, new concepts, and new ideas. As most fantasy settings clearly have the same, or at the very least, similar physics engine to real life, it is inevitable that some experimenting alchemist will stumble upon the fact that an explosion inside a tube will make something come out the other end very, very fast. And given that a lot of these fantasy worlds are thousands of years old, applying the infinite monkey theorem essentially guarantees the eventual existence of that one alchemist, making that one breakthrough that will change that entire world. What we will discuss in this video is applicable to almost any fantasy universe, and several will be referenced throughout, but for the most part, I will be speaking in the context of the one that I know best, which is the Elder Scrolls. Now, a topic such as should, for example, the Elder Scrolls 6 have guns is too complex and subjective to be a yes or no question, it having a yes and no answer. So, I will provide arguments for both sides, and instead of making a definitive statement, allow you to come to your own conclusion. Of course, I know people will get mad anyway, but that's showbiz, baby. First, though, as is the channel tradition, in order to correctly set the scene and provide important context, let's have a look at the real-life lore of firearms. Specifically, the causes and consequences of their implementation, and how all of these might apply to our fantasy universe of choice. They say that life is a race, and it is, specifically an arms race. Promoted to the highest rank of the food chain lobby by learning to throw a rock, our species was skill-based matchmate with the only real competitive enemy left, itself. And ever since, humans were obsessed with the concept of delivering sharp objects from point A to point B. What if we sharpened the rock? What if we put the rock on a stick so our opponent's rock can't hit us? Thus was born the spear, one of the most overpowered items in humanity's history that hard carried us through the early game. This long stick concept was taken to its extreme by the Macedonians, whose phalanxes used so-called sarissas, spears up to 7 meters, or 23 burgers long, absolutely mogging their way across Persia and Central Asia. The meta of human warfare was clear. Reach advantage beats everything. Therefore, the evolution from rock to flintlock to assault rifles with anime skins is simply natural selection, weaponry following the logical path of maximizing effective distance. What technically can be classified as firearms was first implemented by the Byzantines as early as the 7th century of our era, with their use of Greek fire. This was an incendiary weapon system, either in the form of grenades or sprayed from tubes like a flamethrower. Unfortunately, the secret formula was a closely guarded state secret and was lost to the ages. 200 years later, to the east, the alchemists of the Chinese Tang dynasty, in their experiments in search of eternal life and material transmutation, discovered that the combination of 3 components results in a volatile powder. These ingredients were charcoal for burning, saltpeter providing the oxygen for the reaction, and sulfur for stability. Together, they made a compound we now know as gunpowder. The first iterations of gunpowder were not particularly effective, used primarily for fireworks. Later, however, as the formula became more refined, the Chinese also figured out that if you create an explosion within a confined tube, stuff will shoot out the other side. Thus was born the fire lance, what many historians agree to be the first gun. Essentially a bamboo tube stuffed with gunpowder and strapped to a polearm that, once ignited, would eject flames from its mouth. Later, iron shrapnel or even pottery fragments were added into the tube, turning the proto-flamethrower into a proto-shotgun. Around the 13th century, the bamboo tubes would be replaced with metal to better withstand the explosive power of the improved gunpowder, and the addition of more uniform and bespoke projectiles became the standard. Eventually, these still rather crude contraptions began to be used independently of the polearm, which resulted in the creation of the hand cannon, already looking somewhat familiar to our perception of a firearm. Trade and conquest spread the technology across Asia, making its way to Europe. The Europeans made a number of innovations, adding a shoulder stock, improving the barrel construction, and more importantly, inventing the matchlock mechanism, essentially the first ever trigger system, allowing the user to actually aim the gun instead of fiddling around with applying the fuse. Thus was born the arquebus, which was first adopted on a mass scale by the Ottoman Empire around the late 13th and early 14th century, implementing it into their famous Janissary Corps. By the 15th century, advances in metallurgy such as the blast furnace and casting foundries allowed for larger scale production, resulting in a real breakthrough in mass firearm adoption during the Hussite Wars, a series of religious conflicts in Central Europe. At a high level, the Hussites, a sort of proto-Protestant movement, were declared heretics by the church and were to be punished by Crusader armies. The Hussites, often consisting of citizen militia, used firearms to great effect against the professional, heavily armored papal forces. Creating moving fortresses from wagons, the Hussites responded with withering mass fire against the charging steel-clad cavalry with devastating effect. The Hussite Wars highlighted the two main strengths of the firearm. Not only was it shockingly effective against plate armor, it also required minimal training compared to the expensive and time-consuming process of producing an archer or knight, as well as not requiring the upper body strength of said archer nor the horsemanship of said knight. The firearm completely countered the then-current meta tactic of spamming heavy cav, and showed that peasants with pistolas could resist feudal armies. This shifted the entire mindset of warfare, leading to the development of artillery and firing formations that would dominate the field for centuries to come. The history of guns does not end there, of course, but we covered what we need to know for the sake of this video, namely the three main requirements for the invention of the firearm. First is the existence of gunpowder, or any similar volatile compound to provide a propelling explosion for the projectile. Second, sufficiently advanced metallurgy necessary to manufacture a chamber able to withstand the explosive effect of the chemical compound. And finally, a drive for innovation, a problem that can be solved only by the invention of the firearm. So, let's see how these factors apply to a fantasy setting. Gunpowder, or at least several of its equivalents, absolutely exist within multiple fantasy settings. Taking Elder Scrolls as an example, I won't go into too much detail about every single explosive compound in Tamriel, but I will provide some proven cases. In Redguard, Cyrus can trigger an explosion by lighting up barrels of something in the Goblin Cave, and the game also heavily implies the existence of cannons on board ships.
What was that? He's here. The dirigible is ready. Who do you think is attacking the harbor, man? It's the Restless League. They're blowing up our ships.
Making cannons canon in the Elder Scrolls. Various bombs exist throughout the series, from blasting charges in Morrowind to the explosive crossbow bolts in the Dawnguard DLC of Skyrim. Online even has Fireworks, the direct ancestor of the firearm. But Polybius, you say, online isn't canon because I didn't play it, and Redguard is for unks, and all those other examples are just magic. Well, even if that is the case, and explosive chemicals do not exist, here is why in a high fantasy setting like Tamriel, you don't even really need them. Indeed, gunpowder is nothing but a compound that stores chemical potential energy that is converted into explosive kinetic energy necessary to propel something. As such, if there was a way to somehow skip the chemical step and achieve the kinetic blast without gunpowder, that would absolutely work, such as, for example, using magic. Instead of dropping all of your mana on a fireball, a wizard could create a much smaller, localized explosion inside a specialized pistol, firing magically propelled bullets at his opponent. The wizard could even increase or decrease the potency of the explosion, and hence projectile velocity, based on enemy type. Say, to penetrate a fully armored knight, a larger mana investment is required than to light up a goblin wearing a rag loincloth. Barrels sufficiently durable to withstand an explosion powerful enough to make an actually effective firearm need two things: materials and technology. The material part is the easy one to explain, places like Skyrim being absolutely full of various ores, from basic iron to ebony, which is actually a volcanic glass that can be refined to be more durable than any metal. Now, assuming material procurement and refinement are not an issue, let's see if, for example, Tamriel has the manufacturing capabilities to produce firearms on a somewhat realistic scale. Musket barrels were made by forge welding a flat strip of wrought iron around a steel rod to form a tube, and then hammering it into shape. This technique is almost as old as the discovery of iron itself, but is very skill and labor intensive, making complex items forged from multiple pieces of metal plates a rarity in a historic medieval setting. Most fantasy settings, however, for the sake of the cool factor, have an abundance of metal armor, which requires forge welding, unseen on a scale in a similar time period in our history. Indeed, throughout most of our Middle Ages, gambesons and hardened leather were standard, with even chain mail being reserved for the more wealthy, and plate armor almost certainly reflecting noble status. In Elder Scrolls, however, every other homeless skooma addict is clad head to toe in full plate. This could be written off as just a game mechanic, but the point still stands that forge welding exists in Tamriel on a scale sufficient enough for the average smith to crank out at least a couple of barrels a week. While manufacturing metal cylinders is already sufficient for earlier firearm prototypes, such as the muzzle-loaded handguns, I would even go as far as to say that Tamriel specifically has the capability to produce even more advanced firearms like muskets. Evidence of this can be seen in any locked door in Cyrodiil. The fact that Tamrielic craftsmen can mass-produce complex mechanical lock components like springs and tumblers that can be cycled thousands of times without failure by opening and closing doors every day strongly implies that they could produce similar components necessary for a matchlock rifle, which, in reality, actually has much more forgiving tolerances than a door lock. They say that necessity is the mother of invention. Indeed, without a need for firearms, neither the existence of gunpowder equivalents nor the technical ability to manufacture barrels and firing mechanisms would really matter. So, what problems within a fantasy universe would a gun solve? Typically, the first argument provided against the existence of firearms is magic. Magic exists, so there is no need for firearms. After all, specific spells can effectively do the same thing as a firearm, and much more in addition, rendering the invention of the gun unnecessary. While this argument certainly has merit, I would argue the exact opposite. Magic is, in fact, the very problem that a firearm would solve. Magic systems in fiction can be broadly split into two categories: relatively safe to use, like in the Elder Scrolls, and accidentally summoning Satan himself as a side effect, like in Warhammer. In the case of the latter, there is even more necessity for firearms, magic being so unreliable, but even in the case of the former, magic is reserved for those talented and educated few. It is almost always the vocation of the elites. Indeed, it is rare to meet wizards outside of the local prestigious academy in Tamriel, aside from a few illegal necromancer cults. Therefore, it is safe to assume that the vast majority of the population of any given fantasy setting are not magically inclined. Races like the typical fantasy dwarves and places like Skyrim even have an aversion to all things magical. Particularly in settings where magic is an innate trait one is born with, this leaves plenty of otherwise highly intelligent, non-magic users at a severe disadvantage, who certainly would do their best to level the playing field with the wizards, who would no doubt be the most powerful individuals in the setting. Enter the firearm. Alchemy is quite possibly the only magical discipline that requires no actual magical ability. It is just a cooler way of saying chemistry and relies on professional knowledge rather than spells. Competent alchemists, if presented with a problem of dealing with oppressive magic users, would very quickly conceptualize something firearm related.
Who is it you think you see? I am not in danger. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
Indeed, a wizard may incinerate you with a thought. However, even the most powerful of mages typically still have human reaction speeds and vulnerable human bodies, and a well-placed bullet from a peasant that learned to shoot yesterday will swiftly put an end to centuries of arcane study and magical tyranny. No kings, no masters, no wizards.
Some people think they can outsmart me. Maybe. Maybe. I've yet to meet one that can outsmart a bullet.
Magic aside, works of fiction rarely take place at a time of peace. Interesting stories much likelier to occur during a crisis. As such, many fantasy settings are in a state of almost perpetual conflict. Innovation is a crucial part of warfare. More advanced weaponry, dominating those that are caught lacking technologically. Not only would firearms give the advantage to one of the many factions seeking to gain the upper hand against their rivals, it would also provide a non-magical solution to a particular problem that I have alluded to in the past: the abundance of plate armor. There is no overstating just how effective plate is as a means of personal protection. Cuts and thrusts, arrows and blades are easily tankable by a plate-clad knight, despite what modern media will tell you. Such armor does have weaknesses. For example, the armpits, the groin area, the visor slits, but they are situational and difficult to exploit, and require either multiple attackers or somehow incapacitating the armor wearer. Blunt weaponry works well too, the force transferring through the plate, but again, it requires a dangerous melee engagement. Skyrim, for example, during the events of the titular game, is a poor backwater province, and yet, common banditry can be found sporting ebony armor, far superior in quality to steel. In the Dragon Age universe, plate armor is also common, while magic, unlike the Elder Scrolls, is extremely dangerous and unreliable, similar to Warhammer, meaning there is an even more clear niche for firearms. In The Lord of the Rings, even the basic Gondorian foot soldiers and orc troopers are wearing plate, and Tolkien's universe is distinctly low magic as compared to the other two, meaning, again, guns can prove to be incredibly useful. And all of these settings even have their gunpowder equivalents, Dragon Age having Kunari black powder, and the Lord of the Rings having Gandalf's fireworks, and the so-called blasting fire used at Helm's Deep. To be completely honest, there are few settings that wouldn't logically benefit from the invention of the gun, nor lack the necessary prerequisites for its invention. In universes like the Elder Scrolls, any reason why firearms became widespread in the real world is actually multiplied tenfold. Let's imagine that the Hussite Wars that popularized firearm usage in our history happened in Tamriel. Not only would every Crusader foot soldier be clad in full plate, but the rebellious Hussites would also have to deal with a contingent of battle mages sent to support the main force. The only way for a poorly trained citizen militia to stand against an onslaught of steel armor and arcane fire would be firepower of their own. As we have previously established, magic is typically restricted to the elites, and magically inclined individuals and organizations tend to hold vast amounts of power. The Mages Guild of Tamriel, for example, is a massive international conglomerate that, until recently, had an almost complete monopoly on magical education. There are even more secretive, shadowy groups like the Psijics, that have been known to constantly monitor powerful artifacts and even their colleagues in other academies. It wouldn't be a wild assumption to make that powerful centuries-old wizards are very much aware of both the firearm concept and the consequences and effects it would have on their dominance. Perhaps a very strict but invisible grip is maintained on technological advancements, and excessively inventive alchemists often find themselves self-inflicting multiple lightning bolt wounds to the back of their own heads. Now, let's set logic aside for a moment and consider why just because we could have firearms doesn't mean that we should. The main reason is that guns simply kill the magic, and this time I actually mean metaphorically, not literally. The appeal of universes like the Elder Scrolls, like The Lord of the Rings, is the medieval escapism fantasy, and the introduction of something as revolutionary as firearms would simply destroy that illusion. It is one thing having a fantasy setting where guns are already an established fact by default, such as Darkest Dungeon or Pillars of Eternity, but introducing them to a pre-existing, pre-firearm franchise, like The Elder Scrolls 6 for example, is too radical of a change. It is a break from the often necessary medieval stasis, and a stark reminder that time is inevitable even in fantasy, and the settings we love will eventually fade into the past, just like all of us will someday. The last point to make is that a technology as game-changing, no pun intended, as advanced kinetic projectiles would simply change storytelling at its core. Let's take an example to its absolute silly extreme to demonstrate this point. Say Alduin, the World Eater, sent forward in time by ancient Nord heroes in the First Era, reappears just as before in Fourth Era Skyrim. The only difference being, during the several thousand years of his absence, the mortals got quite busy. Alduin then, upon entering Imperial airspace above Helgen, is immediately taken out by a surface-to-air missile battery. Both Ulfric and the Dragonborn are executed by firing squad, and the events of Skyrim never take place. Again, a silly example, but the point still stands. Changing the world fundamentally changes the way stories are told, and sometimes this may not be for the better. Now, you may have noticed that the arguments for are logical, and the arguments against are more emotional, but that does not make them any less valid. Quite the contrary, literature, cinematography, and even video games, which are, by definition, also art, appeal specifically to emotion, and, therefore, it should absolutely not be discounted. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Which side are you on? Or if you have any of your own arguments to make for or against. In terms of the channel's future, I know I've been teasing 40k content for a while, and it is in the works along with some other things, but I just keep finding myself coming back to Skyrim and the Elder Scrolls. It's not a problem, and I can quit whenever I want, I swear. But jokes aside, I think I got maybe one more Elder Scrolls video left in me before I take a break from Todd and finally drop a 40k video, as well as some Divinity content. That statue may not have been Elder Scrolls 6, but given Bethesda's recent activities, that's probably not a bad thing, and Divinity will be the next big RPG, and I absolutely will be covering the lore in the months to come. A huge shout out to my channel members. Your support, as always, means the world to me. Thank you for watching, like and subscribe, and as always, until we meet again.